Hi everybody, welcome to week 6 of Rails Dispatch. This week we're going to talk about extending the router. The Rails 3 router has gotten significantly more advanced, and you definitely want to check out the post this week before you take a look at this screencast. This screencast is going to be an advanced topic, so while in the past few weeks the screencasts have been simple tutorials, this week we're going to go through extending the Rails 3 router. So definitely read the post first before you go watch the screencast. So we're going to start off with some basic concepts that are needed in order to learn how to extend the router. You might be familiar with some of these concepts, but either way, it will be a good refresher. The first concept is something called Action Controller Metal. The idea behind Action Controller Metal in Rails 3 is to provide a mechanism to have a controller that's like Action Controller Base, but without all the functionality, just the functionality that you need. And the reason for this is that while Action Controller Base is very full-featured and powerful, there are occasions where you want a simpler, less feature-rich, but faster controller. In the past, we used something called a metal, a Rails metal, and that was basically a rack application mounted directly into Rails. What we've done in Rails 3 is given you the ability to start with something as fast as that and opt into whatever additional features that you might want on a case-by-case basis. So in Rails 3, Action Controller Base inherits from Action Controller Metal, and in addition to inheriting, it comes with some additional modules. And two of these modules are the Action Controller Rendering module and the Action Controller Layouts module. These modules go into Action Controller Base. Again, the win of Action Controller Metal is that instead of inheriting from Action Controller Base, you can inherit directly from Action Controller Metal, and then let's say you don't want all the other functionality that is in Action Controller Base and you just want rendering and layouts, you can pull those into my controller directly and leave out everything else, getting a much faster controller. When I say faster, bear in mind that I'm not talking about, milliseconds here. What I'm talking about is the difference in, under a millisecond or a millisecond or two, which can make a lot of difference on a very high traffic application, but in general, you won't really need to care about this as a user of Rails. The second core concept here is something called a view path. And what you're normally familiar with in Rails is that your views come out of app/views, and that's the normal place where Rails looks for views. However, if you add engines to Rails, Rails simply adds those engines, the app/views under those engines, to the view path. And what that means, essentially, is that in addition to looking under app/views, Rails will look under engine/app/views. The cool thing about Rails 3 is that these view paths, while normally living on the file system, can also have additional functionality. For instance, you can add a view path that gets its templates out of a SQL database or really any other source. We're not going to talk about that today. Today we're just going to be talking about the normal view paths, but if you would want to do something more advanced, you would be able to do so pretty easily in Rails 3. The next core concept is rack. In order to understand rack, you only really need to understand two concepts. First of all, there is something called the rack server, and what that rack server essentially does is send an environment down to a rack application, and that's a hash. So a rack application is expecting to receive a hash containing the environment. If you're familiar with CGI, the environment looks a lot like a CGI list of variables. The rack application does whatever it wants, and then it returns back to the server an array containing the status, headers, and body. The status is a number like 200, headers is a hash of additional headers, and the body is simply something that responds to each. Here's an example of a simple rack application. Here we have an app, a class called MyApp. It responds to call, takes an environment, and here it pretty much ignores the environment and always returns a status code of 200, a content type of text/HTML, and an array of hello world. Array responds to each, so it'll just return hello world. The nice thing about the rack architecture is that in addition to a server and a client, you can also put some middleware in between. That middleware simply responds to call, takes the environment, does whatever it wants, and then forwards the request on to the next application. So in this case, you can throw a middleware in between and go on to the rack application. Here's an example of a middleware. Middleware gets initialized with an application. That's just going to be the next application in the chain. It responds to call, can do whatever it wants, and then after it's done what it wants, it just simply delegates the request down to the next application. You can have as many of these as you want, and in each case, the middleware will simply send it on to the next middleware until it finally gets to the application. The next concept is the router. Now the router, the simplest part of the router is that you simply match any request. In this case, you match a request whose URL matches /posts to any rack application. Now a nice consequence of the fact that the router maps to any rack application is that for redirection, you can simply do this. Match /:ID to redirect /posts ID. And this over here simply matches /anything onto redirect of /post/ that thing. And this could be very useful if you start off with an application with a flat namespace where every post was at / and later on you decided you wanted to move everything under /posts and you didn't want to break any existing URLs. Now how does this work exactly? This method over here, redirect /post/ ID, simply works something like this. Now the real method redirect is quite a bit more complicated than this, but here's a simple way that you can implement something like this. So you would initialize the redirection with the URL to redirect to, and then you implement call, which is simply a rack application, and you say that the headers are a location of redirect to, content type of text HTML, and then you return a status code of 301, the headers that we set up, and then the text moved permanently. And then we create a redirect method that lives inside of the router that takes a URL and returns a new redirection. Now the nice thing here is that because of the fact that the router simply matches URLs to rack applications, we can return whatever we want here as long as it's a valid rack application, allowing us to encapsulate bits of functionality very simply without getting into craziness inside of the router. So what we're going to do today is we're going to implement static pages inside of the router. Basically, the functionality I'm talking about here is to render a specific page directly from a URL instead of having to take the URL, go to a controller, and have it render a static page. So the first thing we want to do here is generate a new Rails app, Rails static pages. That's going to make a new Rails app. Next, we're going to go into lib and we're going to create a new file called static.rb. And inside of this file, what we want to do is create this class over here. And let's talk about each piece one by one. First of all, the class static inherits from action controller metal. We could inherit from action controller base, that would work fine. But here we're showing off the power of action controller metal to create the fastest possible rendering experience. Now, because of the fact that we're rendering, we're going to include abstract controller layouts and action controller rendering, but we're leaving out all sorts of other things like cookie support, conditional get, and all this sorts of thing. If you wanted these additional functionalities, you could simply pull them in using the appropriate module. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to append the app views directory onto the view path. And the reason why we're doing this is that action controller metal doesn't come with all the default setup as action controller base. So we're going to have to do a few things manually to get the additional speed benefits out of using action controller metal. Finally, we're going to set up the layout to be application, and because again we don't inherit from application controller, we have to specify what the layout is. In this case, if you had a lot of static pages, you might want to use a different layout, such as static, that might be different from your normal application layout. Finally, we're going to define an index, and it's just going to render whatever we put into the static.render variable in the environment. The last step is to set up a routing render file, and this is simply going to create a rack application that we can use inside of the router. And here we're going to make a module called routing render, and it's going to define a method called render, which takes any number of arguments. It's going to grab the application of static equals action, and then it's going to return a lambda. A few things to point out here. First of all, any Rails controller can return a rack application for a particular action by calling the Rails controller.action and then the name of the action. In this case, we called our controller static, so static.actionIndex returns a valid rack application. Second of all, in Ruby, a lambda or a proc responds to call, so we can simply return a lambda as a valid rack application. We don't need to create a separate class. Since it's very simple, we're going to do that here. We simply return a lambda that takes an environment, and inside the environment we stash the arguments that we pass into render, and then we call the action for the static controller with the environment. if you remember, our static controller extracts the arguments out of static.render and simply passes them to render. And so what this means here is that any argument that you could validly pass to the render method in Rails, you can pass to the render method in the router. Finally, we'll just include routing render into our router in static pages application.routes.draw, and then we can simply do match about to render about. And this is exactly the same thing as creating a controller action which does render about. Thank you very much for watching today, extending the Rails router for week 6. I hope you come back next week to watch the next thing in Rails Dispatch. Thank you.